Today I lost track of time.
I think it was in the morning.
It was some time in the past few days. So we had a good conversation with our attorney from Legislative Council yesterday on the way the bill was written, and then learned a little bit more about the world of education. We're kind of new to it, so we thought it'd be helpful to have some experts come in, and thank you for joining us today. I'm David Durfee. I'm the chair of the committee. I'll just go around the room here so that you can learn who we all are, and we'll let you introduce yourselves and get started. I represent Shaftesbury, Glastonbury, and Sunderland in Bennington County.
Rodney Graham, I represent Williamstown and Chelsea.
Jed Lipsky, I represent Stowe in Lamoille County.
Henry Pearl, I represent the towns of Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
I'm David Templeman. I represent Orleans 3. That's Brownington, Barton, and Westmore.
Hi, I'm John O'Brien. I'm on the Windsor Orange line. I represent Royalton and my hometown of Tunbridge.
Hi, I'm Esme Cole. I represent Windsor 6, which is Hartford.
And we have two other committee members who may be joining on Zoom, and then one or two who may be entering the room later. But we won't wait. Let's go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting us. Just for the record, my name's Jess DeCarolis. I'm the Division Director of the Student Pathways Division at the Agency of Education, and I'm joined by my colleague, who I'll let introduce himself.
Hi there, my name is Ian Burfer-Rochford. I'm the Health and Physical Education Content Specialist within the Student Pathways Division at the Agency of Education. It's nice to meet you all.
And just as far as protocol, is it okay if we share our screen? I believe we sent over the testimony, but as we walk through it.
Yes, that would be fine if you want to share your screen. If you have, do you have the ability to do so?
I believe we do.
Okay.
And so, as Ian is pulling that up, one of the things we wanted to walk through, and it looks like there's really sort of three things that the bill is proposing. One is obviously to sort of coordinate and develop a curriculum that would support these efforts. The other would be to add language to Section 906. And then finally to direct the state board to make some rule changes in order to support the effort. Nutrition education and particularly agriculture really are sort of subsets of some content standards. So what we wanted to do is sort of walk through nutrition education and outline what already exists in statute and rule. We then transitioned to agriculture, and then we wanted to sort of talk through some recommendations, but would also love to hear from you, like what are the goals of the bill and how we might be able to support the goals of the bill, even if what's recommended might not align with current regulation and statute, and also ongoing initiatives that are happening right now. And Ian, I don't know are you having some difficulty sharing your screen? Okay, let me try to do this.
While you're working on the technical difficulty, we have a question here. Representative O'Brien.
Hi, Jess. Just because I don't know much about the sort of education world, what are exactly your student pathways, or where does that sort of fit?
Sure, yeah. What that doesn't just describe exactly what it is. Very fair question. So the Student Pathways Division actually is comprised of 6 teams. It oversees a pretty comprehensive scope of programs. So it oversees all content standards, local comprehensive assessment systems, coordinated curriculum, proficiency-based learning, personalized learning, flexible pathways, education technology, pre-technical education, adult education, after school and summer programs. And we also oversee academic recovery and some specific initiatives that have been passed in the last couple of years. Act 28, the Literacy Initiative, Act 66, the Local Wellness Policy, et cetera. It goes on. So really it's sort of like learning across the lifespan. And this is why, this is a really interesting bill, because it really is sort of touching on that sort of cradle to career trajectory when we're thinking about learning and thinking about, how education intersects with sort of workforce development goals and also kind of that future ready state of Vermont.
Thank you.
So we're really delighted to be here. As I said, there's sort of these three areas that we pulled out from the bill in thinking about, developing a curriculum, making some rule changes, and then also ensuring that supervisory unions are teaching agriculture and nutrition education within their curriculum. So with nutrition education, I'm going to turn it over to Ian as the health and physical education specialist, and then we'll transition to agriculture, and then we'll sort of talk about broad themes.
Thanks, Sarah. Jess. So nutrition education is already required as a part of 16 VSA 906 and 131 and 136, which is recently amended, part of X 66. It's also a part of the educational quality standards that new health education be taught in schools, and part of that overarching health education is based on state adopted standards. So we're going to talk a little bit about those different parts.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry, I'm reading it, but I'm also summarizing. So if I'm talking too fast, let me know. So 16 VSA 131 is an overarching defines what comprehensive health looks like. And there's a number of things underneath that in terms of what health education in the state should include. And one of those is nutrition. So nutrition is already a mandated part of health education within the state. Also within that, the Vermont State Board of Education adopted the SHAPE America standards and the National Health Education Standards. And in those standards, there are specific connections to nutrition. So students are, the curriculum itself is being built on standards, and in those standards has touch points to nutrition skills and knowledge. And as you can see as well, within EQS educational quality standards, health education is continually discussed and prominently held. Also, high quality nutrition education, just as a point of reference, through comprehensive health education extends beyond nutrition science. So this is an important point of reference because oftentimes when nutrition is talked about in the classroom, we extend into areas of eating disorders, body image, and health and physical education teachers are uniquely prepared. It's actually part of their rules governing their standards to have knowledge in that space too. So not just within the nutrition science, but those areas and issues that touch around it. Also, all school districts that participate in the National School Lunch Program are required to have a local wellness policy. And within that local wellness policy, there needs to be inclusion of nutrition promotion and education and what the school is doing in those areas as required by federal regulation code. So that's just kind of the overarching part of what nutrition looks like in the state. As you can see, there's lots of different avenues that maintain or support nutrition happening through K-12 schools in Vermont.
And just sort of one thing that's referenced earlier in the testimony to point out is we are about to launch for public comment updated or revisions to the local wellness policy, which was a outgrowth of the passage of Act 66. And one of the charges of that bill was, or that act was really to look for that integration and coherence, right, to refine, because as you can see, there's a lot of different rules and statutes, both at the state and national level, governing instruction in nutrition education and comprehensive health education. To pause there in case there's any questions before we move to the next section.
Okay, so committee questions. David.
Yeah, just one. So the criteria for the curriculum, is that based on USDA, like food pyramid standard stuff, or is it broader than that? What's the basis for the education? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, I think that there's a growing body of knowledge, and this is a space that we're also exploring with folks across Vermont. nutrition is an expansive concept, and it's important to embed it within larger body image and self-health concepts as well. So nutrition can be, obviously there's the nutrition science around it, but there's also things about accepting, your body and advancing your self-image based on not these dominant norms of what body image should look like. So nutrition itself is obviously, embedded in healthy foods, but it also has a lot of more meat to it in terms of what the curriculum may look like in a ninth grade health education classroom.
But the health education standards, and again, all of these links are live, you should be able to go to those sites. But I think it was in 2020, correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, but the health education standards were defined at the national level by the CDC, right? And then it transitioned to SHAPE, right? Maintaining the architecture of the health education standards, but I think under different nomenclature because of that connection also, I think, to physical health or physical education standards. So those are sort of nationally set standards, right? That pull from different bodies of research.
Mm-hmm. And nutrition is touched on in both physical education standards and also in health education standards as well.
Representative O'Brien.
So when these standards are set, are they for K through 12, or sometimes they, start in middle school and go forward?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they are K through 12 developed standards. Obviously, the complexity changes over time. So, for instance, just identifying what you eat and how it relates to your health and how you feel. That may be an early on concept, and then larger constructs around what is healthy body image might be a larger concept that would be connected along those same lines later on.
And then sort of below those state adopted standards are additional supporting materials, and not to introduce a bunch of acronyms because you don't like anything better on a Friday afternoon than a bunch of acronyms, but the proficiency-based graduation requirements, or PBGRs, are sample PBGRs, but that's something that school districts are charged with developing, and most of them have sort of built them off of our models. We also have different resources and tools to demonstrate how things can be integrated or interdisciplinary. So there are other supporting documents and resources to support school districts in developing and implementing curricula aligned to those state standards, which is also required by state board rule.
I'm just wondering, back up in the, not sure which bullet point it is, one that starts with 2120.5 curriculum content.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually more detail there than I had expected to see. And it looks like you've highlighted section C and scientific inquiry, et cetera. So this section of statute directs the supervisory unions to follow the standards, but then goes into, I guess, again, I'll say more detail than I expected. We again, just having had only a preliminary introduction yesterday, had the sense that there was very little in statute, and that the board's rules were mostly what governed what was expected of supervisory unions. So I guess we not necessarily expecting you to help us dig further into this section, but if there's anything you want to add to what I just said, or any reaction to that, be happy to hear it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I get to that a little bit further below, but I'm happy to sort of walk through that now, because what you are pointing out, and to a certain degree, I think it's by design. When you're thinking about passing laws or statute, you want it to be clear and you want it to convey legislative intent clearly, but you also want it to be able to accommodate change over time. So it's sort of like Russian nesting dolls with more greater and greater finer detail as you go down the levels. So you have statute, and then you have board rule, and you have state adopted standards, and then you have the proficiency-based graduation requirements, and then you have the curriculum and coordinated curriculum that identifies the materials, the instructional practices, the goals, right? The assessments that move students to that proficiency, both in science and also in comprehensive health education.
And to clarify, 2120.5, that is coming from board rule too.
Okay, so that's not statute, that's board, that's the board.
No, yep, this is all board rule, and again, have that a little bit further down.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I should have recognized the
Now it's right, yeah.
America structure.
It's Friday,
us,
Friday,
to-
folks.
Yeah, to us too, we're so used to those 2000 something. So yeah, thank you.
So, similar, just walking through, the proposal around agricultural education. So, science education, right, is consistent with what we just saw with nutrition, already outlined in 16 VSA section 906. But as you pointed out, right, that sort of talks about the natural sciences. As you transition to the education quality standards rule series 2000, you get a little bit further, more detail. It does not, the statute, and I would suspect by design, it does not articulate all fields or branches of scientific study individually. And I think one of the concerns would be if we call it out in statute, what is that signaling about the other fields of scientific study? The natural sciences that are referenced, are generally comprised of two branches. And I think when you look, again, just repeating that same excerpt from 2120.5, you see that it articulates the scientific inquiry and content knowledge, including the concepts of life sciences, physical sciences, earth and space sciences, and engineering and design. And again, I think a lot of folks look at that and understand that within those sort of bigger fields or branches, you do have additional fields, dozens of fields embedded within that. The State Board of Education adopted the Next Gen Science Standards to guide science instruction in the state schools. And additionally, and I want to make sure that folks see that within that K-12 continuum, secondary career technical education centers are part of that. They are a flexible pathway available to students. And so many of our CTE centers, 8 at this point, run agriculture programs. And there's the site that you can check out who those folks are. And they align to both our state adopted standards and proficiencies referenced in the Rule 2000 series, but also the agriculture, food, and natural resource career cluster and pathway standards. And those are hyperlinked if you want to take a look at them. Additionally, Future Farmers of America is one of 4 career technical student organizations in Vermont, because I think it is a fairly comprehensive pathway and career cluster, and because so many of our CTE centers use them. And then we've included, just as an example, because again, right, there's so many layers, that you could even teach a course or a class, right? So for instance, if you wanted to teach something devoted to agricultural science education, in which there is alignment to both the Next Gen Science Standards and the CTE Career Cluster pathway standards. The teaching of agricultural science also is encouraged, as you folks are definitely going to be very fluent in the Roswell McLaughlin Farm to School program. And I think, Ian, you were just referencing that maybe 80 schools currently are participating.
80% of schools in Vermont have developed farm to school programs based on the Vermont Department of Agriculture website.
Mm-hmm. And additionally, just as a note, particularly because some of the folks are representing these schools, are Act 67 community school awardees. There are 5. Also, many of them are participating in and actually encouraging sort of community-based education around nutrition and agriculture. So I'm going to pause there. Sure.
You were maybe fading out a little bit there, or maybe I just misheard. Can you say again, Act 67 and 5 something?
Yeah, so Act 67 is the Community Schools Act that was passed in 2021. Yes.
Yeah.
And we have 5 awardees of that 3-year grant program that's funded through ESSER funds, state level ESSER funds. Cabot, Hazen Union High School, North Country Supervisory Union, Virgins Elementary School, and White River Valley Middle School. But all of those 5 SUs and supervisory districts and supervisory unions are pretty heavily invested in participating, and we have a pretty active involvement of the superintendents and principals. So before I,
Sorry, Representative O'Brien has a question.
sure.
Hi, I'm trying to figure out if there's a charge, say, to do nutrition, education, some standards. If one middle school says, has a sugar house and all the kids, make maple sugar, and another school does a whole lab, inside lab scientific work on calories, as long as those two teachers are coordinating with the supervisory unions, curriculum advisors, there's room for great variation from school to school as that would meet the nutrition standards?
Short answer is yes. The standards are oftentimes an outcome based that we're hoping students will achieve or know be able to do at the end of a grade level. So teachers have the ability to develop a curriculum, or at the district level develop a curriculum to help students get to that pathway, to get to that outcome as part of that. So yes, there's lots of different ways to get to the end result, and those sound like some really great ideas. So we should people should start using sugaring housing, because I haven't thought about that too. So that's great.
Representative Templeman.
You mentioned North Country. I'm sorry, North Country
SU.
SU. Are you familiar with Emily DeHoff at that school? She's developed a agricultural education program, actually using my farm as a study farm for the program. I understand that her program doesn't actually have any funding, and it's sort of a one-off. Is this kind of like, an example of a local school union sort of doing their own thing?
So in thinking about doing their own, I think it's consistent with other sort of state legislation and regulation around student-centered learning, personalized learning, flexible pathways, proficiency-based. So it sounds like what is common across the board is that school district supervisory unions must design to the state adopted standards, and that their proficiencies, right, and their curricula has to move students to meeting those standards. And so there may be great differentiation in what local schools and supervisory unions and districts can offer. And lots of times it is going to be tailored to the local community, which we would encourage to really, enrich the local community in that regard. But I think I would just clarify that it's not like anything goes, right?
And to jump on that too, there are a few state level organizations that they're really dedicated to farm to school work. So Vermont Farm to School and Early Childhood Network and Vermont Feed, those are two organizations at the state that really pull people together around farm to school efforts. And help to develop curricula in that space too.
But I do feel like you just gave me an idea about when I make a site visit, what I want to see. So I did want to just get to the third part and just some observations and recommendations. And again, because this is important, but often thinking through like, how do we achieve the intent or the vision that might be identified within a bill, and avoiding some of the pitfalls. And particularly, I think you can even just see from what we've listed here, and we're just talking about sort of two fields of study, is that the greater the policy level complications and complexities, the more that energy gets put to sort of the logistics of that, and less to the like kind of direct instruction and ensuring that high quality instruction, high quality materials selection, high quality assessment development. So one concern would be that specifying nutrition and 16 VSA section 906 part 5 would add, specific language, as we previously mentioned, regarding a field of scientific study excluding all others and inconsistent with the current language. But it also creates a redundancy that then would have to be mediated between 16 VSA section 131 and section 16 VSA section 906 part 3. So even within section 906, right, you would have two things that are competing, and it'd be like, well, is this nutrition within the field of science that is different from, nutrition that is a required component of comprehensive health education. So then you'd have folks spending a lot of time trying to crosswalk, right, the two state adopted standards, right, that, perhaps would not only cause some confusion, but really sort of sap the energy away from that classroom instruction and the learning outcomes that we're seeking, and more into that kind of like technical bureaucratic processes. Additionally, specifying agriculture in 16 VSA section 906 within the natural sciences would not only add a specific branch and fields of scientific study, excluding all others, and there's dozens, but it would also conflict with the Education Quality Standards 2120.5. But I think, again, there's also downstream effects, not just to those specific rules and statutes governing the content, but also in thinking about how is, we have authorized local education agencies to deliver education. And so there are other rules that would also have to be shifted or changed. And this is happening at a time when we know that the Education Quality Standards Series 2000 is already undergoing a revision as a result of Act 1. And also that we are in the midst of developing and adopting district quality standards, which includes coordinated curriculum, local comprehensive assessment systems, needs-based professional learning, et cetera. So I put them here. I'm not going to read through them all, but I think what it outlines is both the rules, translating statute, but also governing supervisory unions, and also identifies that graduation requirements, local graduation requirements, and curriculum coordination, which includes the development of curriculum, are all the responsibilities of supervisory unions. And they've all made investments in developing curriculum to align to state adopted standards. And so in looking at the language, one would want to consider, like, to what degree might this cause some significant disruption if we add this additional layer of complexity. I think the other and last point I'd want to point out is that the bill does not appropriate funds, right? And so frequently, these bills can outline goals and vision, but without necessarily the requisite support, we can find that we're not going to achieve those goals. And so in thinking about developing a statewide curriculum, K-12 and CTE, merging together and resolving any sort of intersections, misalignment across the different content standards would take some time and be a fairly large endeavor. And then it would also require, because you'd want people then to use it, the requisite amount of time and engagement to teach SUs, SDs, either how to transition away from curriculum that they've already developed or purchased, as well as to do that well. And so in thinking about what the goals might be, would love to sort of stop sharing the screen and then just sort of hear like what you might be looking for and how we might be able to meet those goals without necessarily having unintended consequences.
Good. So let's see if we've got, before we move ahead then, as you just suggested, which I think is a good idea, let's just see if we've got other questions. Representative O'Brien.
I was wondering if something like junior Iron Chef would count as nutrition, proficiency.
Interesting, and I'll let you jump in. I would say it depends on what it's designed for. So certainly the first thing I think of is what a fantastic performance assessment, right? But you could also see that it's maybe supporting consumer and family sciences, right? So again, it's hard to say like just globally, but yes, and right.
Yeah, I would echo what Jess said. It's that that may be the kind of final performance, but there'd probably be a lot of learning and outcomes kind of on the way towards that. I think that I wouldn't feel comfortable throwing some middle schoolers in a kitchen and having them cook out of the gate. So having some learning around that's both and embedded. I did do a lot of cooking. I was an elementary school teacher in Cabot actually, and we did a nutrition unit. Students advertise food, different foods that they, wanted to advertise. Oftentimes it was healthy foods, and then we did a lot of cooking in the classroom too. And I can tell you that fourth graders around cooking. It's exciting. It's wonderful. It's also very nerve-wracking for the teacher as well. But there along the way of that learning, there was lots of standards that were being hit that weren't necessarily graded by like who cooked the best or who had the the shiniest advertisement. It was a lot of the things that happened before that too. So, but yeah, that's a great example of a kind of an end result or the performance of some of the learning that could have been embedded.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, thank you. Following up on Representative O'Brien's comment about the Iron Chef, we took a lot of testimony a month or so ago, 6 weeks ago, about on farm to school initiatives. And in that process, we had a number of school nutritionists, one from down near Bellows Falls, one from up in central Lamoille, and one from Crossed Brook School. And we were overwhelmingly impressed with the influence of that nutritionist leadership within that school to expand the productivity and engagement in the farm to school appreciation of that whole initiative. And their leadership, I think the one from Crossed Brook was one who ran this Iron Chef that you were lauding. How, from this humble committee, we observe that kind of leadership isn't necessarily all over the state and really drives the success of programs like that. Is that an additional challenge aside from the whole agency of education, all the other challenges of having it relevant, not conflicting with other programs, et cetera?
Yeah, no, Ian, I'll let you jump in. But I think you've put your finger on, okay, so what would be the action step that would get you to the place of saying, how do we grow instructors who can become those leaders who offer this really dynamic, rigorous education in nutrition and agriculture? And one thing that I'd be concerned about is this educator that you're referencing might then become responsible for the policy, like the shifted policy, the reworking of curriculum, which, right, in one person, it's like, okay, so that does that pull from some other area? One thing that is most effective, right, in improving educators' facility and expertise is really providing professional learning. And that not only is that one of our education quality standards that supervisory unions are responsible for, but that is an area in which the state can contribute in providing that professional learning to grow up that expertise, because we know it's not a static system, right? You've got veterans who are leaving the field or retiring. You've got new folks coming in, and they come out of teacher prep programs. And this is in no way a knock on teacher prep programs, but no one enters a job like ready to go, right? You have to learn the job a little bit on the job. So I think if the goal is how do we build up that expertise and leadership, I think we invest in those educators, right, in their professional learning.
Well, while we're on that, what would that investment look like? And maybe that's what you were going to jump into next.
Ian, did you want to add something first?
I was just going to say that there are groups and organizations out there that do provide those professional learnings already in place. I can't speak for them, but I know that the Vermont Feeds, they do a number of things. At Shelburne Farms, I went to one of their trainings. It was fantastic, where we learned a lot about the farm to school and nutrition pieces together. So I don't know what, I'm not the expert in that space, but I would just say that mention that as a space for professional learning that's already in place in the state. But go ahead, Jess, sorry.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that question. And obviously that's your privilege to identify, but that's something that we'd want to talk with those partners. We also have a regular coordination meeting that meets, is it every 3 weeks or 6 weeks, with the Vermont Department of Health. Ian and I both sit in that space, as well as partners at UVM. I'm happy to come back and sort of give you some insight around that. I wouldn't want to speak off the cuff.
Okay, now, Representative,
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question or word it. I think the goal of understanding, I think the first goal is understanding what is currently happening, which you've outlined some. I'm wondering more about, because the intent obviously of this bill is a little bit of, managing exposure, if you will, to kids in agriculture, and ensuring that when they leave high school, they've had an adequate, and how we define that is yet to be determined, but an adequate level of exposure to agriculture and nutrition. And I'm trying to get my head around how do we measure that and currently. And I'm wondering if that's through these proficiency standards or I guess I'm curious, what exactly right now do children have to know throughout the cycle, to graduate high school? And obviously I'm feeling or hearing that that's maybe extremely variable throughout the state. And I guess just if you can help me understand that process a little bit more, and maybe how we as a committee can kind of measure that and know what our kids are getting. I don't know if that's making sense.
No, I get it, right. And it's hard to, sometimes it's hard to articulate, and because Vermont has such a long-standing tradition of local control, right, that it means, and for good reason, right, to sort of honor the autonomy of communities, it means that you really are having to move across each SU. Now, what is true is that all of them need to be designed to the state adopted standards, right? All of them must articulate what those graduation requirements are, and they're not divorced. They have to be aligned to those standards. But you're right if you're talking about okay, I want to get into the actual granular content, what are they reading, what are the units, et cetera. And that's not the grain size that we operate at. However, you have programs of study that most schools are publishing in some web space, usually just on their website, but knowing that they use learning management systems that parents and community members can log into, that will give you that granular level of detail. I think what's interesting about what you were saying is you're talking about exposure, right? And so one of the things that I would want to differentiate is that exposure is one thing, and being proficient, meeting a standard is sort of another. And then when we look at our career technical education and those clusters, those programs, those program standards, now you're really getting into moving into expertise, right? Where you might earn an industry recognized credential, et cetera. So I think that exposure might be tough to measure. I think it would be easier to identify what are those critical proficiencies that students are expected to have, what are the graduation requirements, and what are those program standards that CTE students have to meet. I think some of those things you can actually identify within those hyperlinks that we provided, but we could follow up and send you some examples of how local schools and districts also communicate their program of study and their graduation requirements, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Representative Graham.
My question is kind of how far back in the food chain does these programs start? You go to the store and buy food and figure out how to, buy nutritional food and prepare it or whatever. Or does it go all the way back to where put the seed in the soil or raise the cow or, because I feel there's a big disconnect on society today as to where their food actually starts. And you hear a lot of people that say, well, I just go to the store and get my food.
I appreciate that question. I think it depends obviously with the knowledge and comfort of the teacher and also what learning targets that they're going for. Their food systems are a part of, I believe, the next gen science standards. That's not my area of forte. I know that was something I did with my students. So, we would track where our food came from. There's this lesson that I think of as what makes a hamburger. So students are, going back and thinking about all the different elements and where they came from that makes a hamburger. I know that's a very simple and silly way to do it, but that, those are some of the questions that engage students as well. So I think that it depends on the teacher, depends on their expertise and comfort level in that space, but there are standards that do support engaging with the food system.
I think there's something that we didn't address or mention is also there's a lot of interdisciplinary learning that can happen. So your example really reminds me of some lessons that folks might engage in around civic literacy or equity literacy or climate justice when thinking about, okay, where does your food come from? What are the impacts when you're thinking about local food systems versus food systems or food chains that are further away? So, again, I think there are a lot of different places in which this education and instruction can be happening that might not sort of be what people immediately think about in addition to comprehensive health education and science education.
Not seeing any other questions here. So wasn't sure, Jess or Ian, did you have other thoughts or suggestions that you wanted to throw out?
No, I mean, I think just sort of, generally, and not to put too fine a point on it, I would just express the agency's concern about adding another layer of statute and policy that might create greater complexity. And, we're really interested in thinking about how can we, communicate the values that are clearly identified in the bill and support those values through things like professional learning and following up with both links as examples to further explicate, that sort of structure, but also some recommendations about how that could be supported through professional learning.
One of the things I was thinking as you were showing the presentation earlier is that the CTE in Bennington County has had at times an ag program. I don't think they do at the moment, and it goes back a while, but my recollection is they stopped doing it because either there wasn't the interest or there wasn't an instructor. And I think that that's probably not unique to that particular district. But it goes to show that it's driven by other forces, not by anybody's rule or anything in statute, and nobody has to do that. If people are interested and there happens to be somebody to teach it, then they'll do it. So
yeah, no, I appreciate you articulating. It can create some pinch points, right? Particularly now with educator workforce shortage issues. And this is something that actually the Joint Fiscal Office was charged with conducting a funding and governance study of CTE that, an initial report is being, I think, delivered or an overview next week. And then there'll be a final report delivered to the agency and to the legislature. And it's exactly this issue, which is how do we resource up and educate up systems to deliver the education that they want to deliver as necessary versus create conditions in which they can't meet the goals, right? And for forces that are outside their control.
So just wanted to back up a little bit to the curriculum question. So local supervisory unions that's what local control means, really. I mean, and I'll just toss out parenthetically that as a former school board member, we'd often hear, yeah, there's really not much local control anymore. It's all dictated by Montpelier. So it's interesting to hear now in this context, we don't have any. We don't have any say at all. It's all local control. But and obviously there's some answer in the middle there. But are there in fact? I mean, where do the curricula? Is that the right plural? Do you use that word, or should I say curriculum so I don't sound like I majored in Latin, which I didn't? Where do they come from? And in fact, do many supervisory unions have the same curricula that the next one does? Where do they come from?
But it depends. Some might purchase curriculum to provide like a mapped out scope and sequence so they can really focus on instructional practices and developing high quality assessments or performance assessments. Some, and usually it's maybe supervisory unions or districts that might have more personnel and might be resourced differently, can actually develop their own coordinated curriculum, and they'll use staff and usually a curriculum leader or assistant superintendent to develop that. They often have also instructional coaches. So it really is the sort of full gamut. One of the things that the agency has been focusing on, because it's not the remit of the agency to develop statewide curriculum and it's not mandated, is to build out frameworks to provide some additional focus and suggestions to supervisory unions and districts, which I think they tend to find to be helpful. We have usually resources where we map out, like, have you checked out these particular resources that might be of use to you, depending on where you're wanting to lean in or build out your curriculum. But it really, as you pointed out, can also depend on whether you have someone who's got some real fluency and leadership because they've been teaching something for a long time, that they might be able to adapt, versus somebody who's a new educator coming in, might not have the sort of capacity to develop that curriculum, because their job really should be focusing on delivering a curriculum right to the students in the classroom. So it really is a full gamut, but it's an area that we're leaning into. I think sample curricula can be really helpful just as a sort of insight. And again, this is, Vermont's population is the size of like a small district in another state at times, is in talking to another state around a K-12 curriculum that they had developed for statewide use in literacy, rang in at about $10 million, right, to have both digitally available and also physically being able to send out materials. So, these are all things, and again, that's, it was like a big state, so I'm sure it would be smaller, but, I had sticker shock. So, I think to the degree in which what people can afford might make decisions about how they're sort of investing and building this out. But almost every supervisory union, and I'm saying almost just because there can always be that outlier, has made significant investments in building out curricula, coordinated curricula over time, because of the introduction of proficiency-based graduation requirements and the refinement of creating and interweaving those flexible pathways for students. So it has been a pretty significant investment on the part of supervisory unions and districts over time, I would say in the last 10 years or so.
Representative O'Brien.
I was wondering, are there any examples that you could think of where the General Assembly here has essentially mandated something educational? So I'm thinking like we're also obsessed with civics, and we say every student K through 12 has to visit the State House, or every student K through 12 at some point in their educational 13 years has to go to a dairy farm. Can you think of any examples like that that might not necessarily be curriculum or proficiency based, but you're charged with, something educational?
Ian, go ahead and step in, and then I'm happy to
You're
pick it up.
Well, I think that there is space for mandates happen in terms of this is what we need to see in schools. Like that happens from the federal government to the state government. Oftentimes it depends how far down the line you are getting in terms of what to see on the ground. So curriculum is a space that the General Assembly can provide kind of a framework around to kind of tighten what the board does, which the board can then realize it and make it, provide more description for what it looks like. I think that it's a harder dynamic within this local control space, because how far down and how far, close to the taking away supervisory unions' power as part of it is outside my pay grade. But that's some of the conversation too. But yeah, Jess, you can kind of add on to that as well on the civic space too, because I know that's something that you've been talking about.
Yeah, and I might avoid the civic space at this particular moment, but I the thing that first comes to mind as far as like a mandate that was really explicit and specific is that every student beginning in grade 7 all the way through grade 12 will have a PLP, a personalized learning plan, right? And that is a component of a curriculum, and that came through in Act 77 as part of the Flexible Pathways Initiative. And I think the lesson from that, which, you know, we oversee, my division oversees Act 77, right? I feel and believe deeply in the power of students starting to curate a professional presence in the world so that they can transition well and communicate what they want as far as their goals and dreams and connecting that to their learning trajectory. But when you don't sufficiently resource a massive shift statewide with a very specific requirement, what happens is you get that implementation that's offset from town to town, school to school, supervisory union to supervisory union that can create the appearance minimally of either folks not doing the work or an inequity and student experience over time. And so I think that recommendation is to say, if the goal is we would love to have a statewide example coordinated curriculum, right, that supervisory unions could elect to use as a support, we would just say it takes energy, personnel, and resources in order to do that. Otherwise, it will just be delayed, or it will drag on, or it won't, meet the communities that you're hoping it will reach.
Was that state or federal, the PLP?
State.
Oh.
And in terms of curriculum too, there is a number of health content that needs to be included within health curriculum as part of the Act or 16 VSA 131 that defines all the things that should go in terms of sexual health, nutrition, so that there is a space to kind of not go all the way down to week 5, 3rd grade lesson. This is what it's supposed to look like, but there has been, some sort of a precedent around that. But again, the resources and support in that area is all the more important for making sure that that's realized as well.
Somebody brought up civics, and I know that there are several bills that are probably making their way through the Education Committee that would do something similar. Not food or ag or nutrition, but would require the teaching of something or another. Some of which I think are great ideas. And so you'll probably be having the same conversation if you haven't already. Maybe you do every year, every session, every but it does strike me that, yeah, some of these are great ideas. And how do you get from, the great idea to, reality when given the hurdles, structural hurdles, reasonable hurdles, but also just sort of, that's the way the system works.
Yeah. I really appreciate you asking that question, because I think too it's about perception. So absolutely there are hurdles or barriers or technical barriers, right, to some of the things that people might be thinking about doing, but there's also tremendous opportunity, right? So if we go back to the Iron Chef example, being able to maybe host and foster that as a learning continuum in one school could be impinged when we add more and more very specific requirements. So I think there's the Holocaust education bill where it's like every year beginning in grade 6 hours of instruction around Holocaust education, which has outcomes that actually align to our C3 state adopted standards, right? But also in thinking about, so in order to organize around that, right, that's going to take some pretty significant systemic sort of shifts that then can have this consequence of saying, okay, well, if we keep adding these layers on, to what degree does the system collapse under these layers and reduce the ability to be really adaptive, flexible, personalized for those really meaningful, rigorous learning opportunities? So I think what's hard is that people want like hard data, right? So it's like every year I usually have to come in some manner or form around some content area to say, like, how many kids are learning this very specific topic, right, in this field of study? And you try to pull down class enrollment information, but we don't collect syllabi for every class taught K-12, right? We have standards, we have classes, we have learning objectives, but I think that that's then gives the appearance that something's not happening. And so there's a little bit too around how can we better communicate the learning that's happening? And then also thinking about how do we support increasing the opportunity for students to meet those learning objectives. And usually that's going to be around investments in professional learning, right? Investments in how to support curriculum development at the local level, which is their responsibility. And that usually means technical assistance, et cetera. But, just sort of requiring something doesn't necessarily achieve the outcome, right? Because it's the instruction, or as Ian pointed out at the beginning of our testimony, we don't jump right to assessment, right? It's the instructional pathway to get you to that assessment.
Great. Well, I think, thank you for sort of wrapping up with that. I think that's useful information. We're about at the end of the hour, so I think maybe we'll stop the conversation there for today anyways. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you so much for having us, and we can follow up with that additional information, but feel free to reach out anytime.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good
Nice meeting
afternoon.
you all. Thank you.
Interesting. Both kind of ambiguous and complicated.
Yeah, I mean, well, before we leave this subject, anybody have any thoughts before we leave the subject?
I'm just compelled to bring up the amount of time students have to eat lunch. That's where my mind kept on going to that 20 minutes, but kind of unrelated, so.
Yeah, I mean, these are all things obviously that I've had worked through a little bit before, and I think that's the scope of the bill, or starting the conversation, is figuring out. But I think we're clear on what we want to do. It's very complicated how to do it, and whether it's a top down, carrot or the stick type of thing, and how to if it's something that maybe too much to try to force or you're going to create more problems trying to achieve the objective by really creating some sort of structure around it. Maybe it's there's a better way of encouraging, even getting more to the root of the problem and encouraging professional development or teachers to, maybe we need to teach teachers before they can teach the kids, that sort of thing.
Representative Cole.
I just got an email just randomly from a teacher at Woodstock Middle School who is called an agricultural innovation teacher. And apparently this position has existed for many years. And so maybe, and it is very specifically to the seed part and the beginning aspect, I think, is what her content is. So I could see what her story is and maybe the school's story of how that came to be and how it's been maintained in that curriculum.
Did she email you in reference to the conversation we're having now, or?
No, she was interested in the universal school meals stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that person is interested in testifying on the bill.
Okay.
Oh,
Well,
Janice?
okay, good. We can follow up.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where my mind is going too, is that your idea of maybe not through curriculum, but the feet on the ground. And then this idea, I mean, it seems to be a human problem or the solution is a human solution, having the right training, because it seems like a lot of these school unions, the limit, the point of limitation is the educator, maybe not the curriculum, because the curriculum sounds a little amorphous as far as they're given these structures, but then what you do with that really depends on the human who's interpreting it.
When we were, the farm to school program seems like it might be a good place to get some, hear from again, specific to what, what we're trying to do or thinking about here. So maybe that'll be our next, next step next week. But, I think this was helpful just to sort of hear what